Hi, welcome back to another video. Hopefully, well, if this is the first time here, obviously welcome. Hopefully you'll find this helpful. So it's going to be hopefully a fairly short video, but today just thought I'd talk over a few things to do with similarities in the Medicine Through Time board for Edexcel. So you do get a question on this GCSE paper that asks you for either a similarity or a difference between two different time periods and something specific. So hopefully you might have come across this question before. I will say it is only a 4-mark question. It's not something to panic about, but obviously we want to get all the marks possible, and we want to show that we know similarities and differences. So just important to note that they can ask you for differences as well. It is not just similarities. So I just thought I'd go through based on category. So we'll start off with understanding of illness. So I've just done a brief rundown of a few things, not everything. I'm sure I've missed a couple of things, but as I say, for a 4-mark question, you don't really need to know more than this. So first of all, religion influenced ideas about disease. So obviously, we see this most potently in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Worth sort of pointing out, obviously, hopefully you remember that the dissolution of the monasteries and the move away from the church for various reasons has obviously caused that to decline as we reach the later Enlightenment stage. But religion is still very prominent even into the Enlightenment period as well, or sometimes people call that the industrial period. I say Enlightenment, so does the board from what I can see, but if you say industrial, that's fine. But yeah, so understanding of illness does stem from religion, obviously specifically Christianity. Supernatural explanations existed alongside scientific ones. So again, we see this more into the bit where I guess people are deciding if they want to move away from religion or not. So Renaissance, Enlightenment, kind of see that science emerges, but people sort of still link this to supernatural phenomenon. For example, we could think about the idea of transference, so that cause of disease, and understanding of illness is that, you know, you transfer disease to something, not in the sense of we know now through germs. If you'd like to understand a bit more, then I have got a playlist for the Medicine Through Time board, and I've talked about it before. But yes, so idea of transference as a cause of disease, supernatural also linking into that, talking about, you know, supernatural cause of disease that is just unexplained. So there's a few things that crop up. So there's scientific, you know, evidence, but then people still believe in the supernatural and the religious as well. And then new ideas often face opposition. This is both in understanding of illness and treatments. For example, we tend to see this more so into the Enlightenment and that sort of era. For example, Louis Pasteur's germ theory in 1861, as much as we know that that is such a massive turning point and so significant, that doesn't mean that everybody just suddenly dropped their ideas on what they thought caused disease and their understanding of illness. It took people a while to build up to accepting this germ theory and seeing more scientific backing on it. Do also get this still in the modern period. You know, new ideas do face opposition. Sometimes those ideas are incorrect, but you know, even if they are correct, typically we see that they do face some sort of resistance from people. So I hope that kind of made sense in terms of understanding of illness. So religion influences it. Supernatural is still existing parallel with scientific explanation emerging, but opposition is faced for pretty much everybody finding out new causes and understanding of disease. So that brings us on to actual causes of illness. So first one is that people believe lifestyle affected health. So this obviously is something that is really highlighted in the modern section, because the government realises that obviously people's lifestyles are linked to their disease and their well-being. So things like, you know, sugar tax, avoiding junk food, anti-smoking campaigns, avoiding sunbeds, etc., that sort of thing we see in the modern period. But we can also see this in things like the Middle Ages and Renaissance, where, you know, the Regimen Sanitatis was a health or well-being guide, I suppose, that physicians would give out, and it had things like, you know, don't consume excess food, eat everything in moderation, have things generally in moderation. So we see that actually people do believe that lifestyle affects health across pretty much the entire time period. Poverty increases illness. Again, we do see that this is an understanding as to why people get sick. So I think the understanding, though, if we want to take it to a deeper level, generally speaking, if you're thinking Middle Ages, they're not thinking, poor people live in squalid areas and therefore get ill because they have bacteria in those areas. They're not thinking that. They're probably thinking, well, you're a grubby poor person and I don't want to be near you because poor people inherently are diseased. That's probably what their thought is. Whereas obviously if we scoot over to the modern era, or even late Enlightenment, we begin to understand that poverty causes disease because those areas are not looked after. It's not that those people are inherently diseased. So for example, living in a slum, we know that obviously poverty, that's not people's fault. That's where they live for various reasons. And then work like through John Snow, cholera, etc., public health acts, and the reports into that through Chadwick, so on. We see that they investigate that and realise that obviously the government needs to act in order to try and save people, because this links into the first point, doesn't it, is that lifestyle affects your health and whether that's in your control or not. So this also links, which is that overcrowding spreads disease. We start to see this more, the actual understanding of this more later on. But medieval towns have this, Enlightenment cities have this, and then obviously we have modern outbreaks that spread we know it spreads faster because of the amount of overcrowding, but we tend to see that people don't really put two and two together about overcrowding necessarily until much later on. So things like living in a back-to-back house with no, airflow, or even thinking about, famous people. Emily Bronte lived up north in horrific conditions in terms of sanitary conditions. So we kind of get to know that overcrowding causes disease, but this is a lot later. So dirty water spreads disease. Again, we do see this especially in the cholera outbreak with Jon Snow. The only thing that I will say about that is that obviously just remember that Jon Snow cannot explain why he has found out what he's found out. He proves that the cholera is coming from the water pump, but it's not till later on, because that's 1854, it's not till 1861 when Louis Pasteur says that's because it's germs, that we actually can fully understand that Jon Snow was correct and it is a waterborne disease. So that's things like the Enlightenment period. And then it's not till the late Enlightenment that we start to get, sewers put in place. And that sort of travels into the early modern period. Early modern as in like 1900. I didn't mean early modern as in, late medieval. So dirty water spreads disease. So yes, cause of illness, obviously all these things are prevalent in the Middle Ages because that is when health is pretty much at the worst. But the actual understanding alters as we go along, but the similarities are still there. War encourages disease to spread. Again, obviously Middle Ages will be on there, with people like John Ardern starting to realise that actually surgery is an option. People have to have surgery to get rid of things. It doesn't always work. But then war obviously makes it worse, and it could be for a variety of reasons, such as if you look at the Western Front sector, which is the case study in this Medicine Through Time unit, you should have been told that obviously France in the Western Front was previously farmland, so it was fertilised ground, so being wounded and then slopping about in mud would cause infection into your wounds very easily, for example. So we have that. Okay, so the last one for causes is trade and travel spread disease. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, we have the case study of the Black Death. So this is a great example because obviously we know that, they come to find out later, but we know that it gets brought in via boats, and that's through trade and travel. Obviously, we could argue this for all time periods. Really, you just have to think of a specific that you'd want to use. Personally, I think the medieval one's a really good one, but also thinking about different things, such as I know that it's a bit too modern perhaps, so I wouldn't say necessarily use this one, but just as an example, you could argue something like COVID was spread through trade and travel, but obviously just be mindful of what your spec allows, because if you're looking at this for Edexcel Edexcel, that's great, but if you're looking at this for OCR or AQA, so on, I don't know what your spec says. So in terms of preventions, we've got governments often reacted slowly to disease. We can see this across the whole time period, apart from the later modern sort of element. So, for example, in the Enlightenment, you can argue, yes, okay, they put the Public Health Acts in, but this isn't until 1848 and 1875, and it's only the 1875 one that actually says don't dump your waste into water systems and stuff like that. So you could actually say, plenty of disease has been rife, such as, for example, cholera. And the government haven't exactly done their due diligence here, and this is because of that laissez-faire attitude that they had. Governments react slowly to other things, for example, the Black Death in the Middle Ages. The government don't really, government in quote marks, obviously it's very different then, but the sort of officials don't really have a prompt response to this. Slightly better in the Renaissance in terms of the 1665 Great Plague. Much better government response with that, but still very slow reactions. Then isolation and quarantine used to stop disease spreading. We do see this with pest houses, which I've put an image of here, which obviously you would be sent there. For example, if you had leprosy, you might be sent to a leper house or a lazar house. Same with the plague as well. Then we see this again with the Renaissance plague, with the 1665 one. And then obviously in modern pandemics as well, we do use quarantine and isolation, such as with scarlet fever, Spanish flu. That's what I meant to say, sorry, not scarlet fever, Spanish flu, and COVID as well, as a recent example. I personally would maybe go with medieval and Renaissance for this, just because they fit quite nicely with each other, because it's effectively the same thing, it's the plague, but obviously both of them use isolation or quarantine for that. So good hygiene is encouraged, although it's important to note that the reasons for the hygiene do alter a bit. So we talked about before with the medieval period of regimen sanitatis and bathing. Belief was held that, bathing in water, fully submerging your body, would open your pores up to disease. So they kind of didn't understand that. Whereas in the Renaissance, we see this shift into bathing with linen rags. So again, good hygiene is still encouraged. And then obviously in the modern period, it definitely is, especially after learning about germs. And if you're doing AQA, you could talk about how Semmelweis introduces things like hand washing and so on. So care for the sick. So this is that hospitals continued throughout the period. So we see hospitals from the Middle Ages with monastery hospitals through the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, and then obviously as they are now in the modern period where we have the NHS form in 1948. So hospitals are very much an easy one, and I doubt that you will be asked about hospitals because it is so straightforward, because you can literally use any time period. Next one is religious groups cared for the sick. This one does tend to shut off about the Renaissance era in terms of en masse. Obviously, your expectation is that if you go to a religious order and say, I'm ill, please look after me, is that they will, but you can't bank on that, really. Whereas in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this is very much a done thing, such as the monastery hospitals. Also talking about, wise women, that's why I have put them on here as a separate point, but, people caring for people was just a generally given thing that lower class or average people would use a monastery hospital, and then obviously if you were upper class, you'd be able to have a physician, but these monastery hospitals are obviously attached to religious groups, nunneries, monasteries, etc. Doctors treated mainly wealthy people. This is a bit of care and treatment. So this is in terms of physicians with the medieval period, and then it really spans through in towards the 1700s and the 1800s in terms of, if you can cough the cash up, then you get the money first, the treatment first, and the care first, which we don't really see now in terms of the fact that we do have the NHS, which is obviously free at the point of use. So obviously it is taxpayer funded, but the point of it is that it treats everybody for, no money on the day that you go. And that, is available to everybody no matter what your class is or your status. Whereas obviously, especially in the Middle Ages, you could only afford a physician if you had the money. So that very much limited people. So, but it is true that doctors mainly treat wealthy people. Just be mindful that this sort of drops off in the mid to end of Enlightenment era, because obviously then we start to see treatment for all and care for all. Wise women, so women caring for the sick at home. Again, you can argue this is throughout all periods, but it is less so in modern times. I would maybe just stick to using this similarity in the medieval and Renaissance periods. However, you can argue that it is still used throughout the whole time, but I personally would go for the earlier parts, because again, a bit like the monastery care, it is very much prevalent compared to now where it's not. And then we have treatments. So treatments, herbal remedies, they continue to be used. Technically, we still use them. I didn't put it on because it's not, the mainstream, I suppose. Whereas you can argue that obviously apothecaries are used for many, many, many years. So this image that on the last slide supposedly is meant to be a 1700s apothecary. So this is used for a very long time, and obviously is available to everyone really, and physicians would obviously guide people in that direction with a prescription after a diagnosis in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and then this is still used with into the Enlightenment. Traditional remedies survived despite new discoveries. So again, thinking of things that we do to treat things like colds. So technically you could argue Middle Ages as well to a degree, in the sense of things like theory of opposites. If you're too hot, you'll try and cool down. If you're too cold, then you'll put more clothes on to be warmer, etc., etc. If you've got a bunged up face, you blow it out. So things like theories of opposites, just to do the opposite thing. So technically that is something that survives, but that's more I don't know, it's up to you if you want to use that. But traditional remedies, yes, they do survive despite new discoveries. But also things such as general medical advice tends to survive as well with new discoveries. So such as things like having things in moderation as a prevention to illness as well. So that kind of ties in nicely there. And then we have bloodletting. This is continued for a very, very long time. Obviously not really done now. Some countries I'm sure will still probably do this somewhere, but in at least the Western world we definitely don't. So bloodletting is obviously one of those things about you have too much blood and too much of that humour, and that addresses that humoral imbalance. And this is done, and at least, or in more general terms, treatment of the four humours are done all the way into the early Enlightenment. Then surgery remains dangerous until the 1800s, as I'm sure you could probably evidence quite easily. Even in the sense of when we do get discoveries for surgery. So even things like, the antiseptic of carbolic acid from Lister, even this can be accidentally overused and cause more injury. Things like using chloroform in the early stages can get that wrong and accidentally, kill someone. So yeah, there's lots of incidents where we've seen that that's not quite gone to plan. Surgery remains dangerous, generally speaking, like up until the modern period. But for example, in the Middle Ages you can argue that John Ardern was a good surgeon for anal tumours, but he did only have a 50% success rate, which was good for the time, but it is still very much 50-50 whether you live or die, or at least have a very, very sore bum. So yes, these are some of the similarities that I've put down. Obviously up to you if you want to use any of them. I hope it sort of just made a bit of sense in terms of comparison. But yeah, don't worry about it. It's only 4 marks. Just try and do your best. And yeah, it can be a difference as well, though. Just remember that. So when you get the paper, just make sure you notice if it's a difference or a similarity. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and check out my playlist if you've got any other things you'd like to look at, and hopefully I will see you in another video soon. Bye.